Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are joining us today. My name is Mahmut Cengiz. I'm Associate Professor and Research Faculty at Terrorism, Transnational Crime and Corruption Center at George Mason University. And on behalf of the team at the Global Terrorism Trends and Analysis Center, GTTAC, I will be moderating this session. This is a continuation of a series of talks by eminent people in the field of terrorism. The views expressed are those of the presenter. So far, our events have discussed terrorism by its typologies, such as right-wing extremism and jihadism, as well as events on regional basis. And our events have hosted distinguished speakers to talk about global terrorism. Al-Shabaab, Al-Qaeda, Boko Haram, and ISIS are only a few of them. On the other hand, there have been ongoing debates on the effectiveness of counterterrorism policies. Every year, terrorism databases have been recording a very consistent number of terrorist incidents, ranging from 8,000 to 10,000 in the last 4 years. There have been failures, and states have conflicting views and do not have harmony on their approaches to global terrorist organizations. Today's event will host Dr. Gardner and focus on whether the US and Europe have conflicting views on the global war on terrorism. Dr. Gardner is full professor of the Department of History and Politics at the American University of Paris. He was a visiting professor at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies before moving to the American University of Paris in September 1990. He is the author of many books, the most recent one published this year, Toward an Alternative Transatlantic Strategy. And also in the last 4 years, he is the author of IR Theory, Historical Analogy, and the Major Power War. And another one, World War Trump, The Risks of America's New Nationalism. And another one, Crimea, Global Rivalry, and the Vengeance of History. He is a member of the World Association of International Studies, founded at Stanford University. He is on the board of advisors on the Fondation, Other News, Voices Against the Tide, and also Human Dignity and the Humiliation Studies. Please use the Q&A function in Zoom. We will have about 20 minutes for dialogue after Dr. Gardner's presentation. Dr. Gardner, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mark. Let me get to the point here. We're obviously in a great crisis. The global war on terrorism has begun to morph into global power rivalry, or what the State Department calls great power competition. And that in turn could soon, with the Ukraine crisis, in my view, morph into major power confrontation using techniques of hybrid warfare. In effect, US-led military operations, interventions in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, plus the French-European military intervention in Mali, all as part of the generic global war on terrorism, have not succeeded in building even adequately sustainable states and societies in any of these countries and regions. In addition, the US strategic focus on GWOT, Global War on Terrorism, and so-called overseas contingency operations has cost about at least $8 trillion, according to the Cost of War project at Brown's Watson Center, have counterproductively opened the door to increased Russian, Chinese, and Iranian influence, as is also the case for the French military intervention in Mali in 2013 that followed in the wake of the collapse of the Gaddafi regime after NATO's 2011 intervention. So my argument today is that the global war of terrorism has opened up a new conflict zone in which the major powers are entering. In addition to their geopolitical disputes in Europe and Asia, they are facing new disputes in wider Middle East, Afghanistan, and elsewhere. So there are 5 interacting phases of the US-European relations in regard to the global war on terrorism since the September 11 attacks. First, of course, is the 2001 Afghan War, then the 2003 Iraq War, 2011 Libyan War, 2013 French intervention in Mali, and 2014 begins a new phase in history, the beginning of major power rivalry as Russia invades Crimea with little green men using techniques of hybrid warfare. My point is that states have begun to adopt hybrid techniques of warfare and begin to act like terrorists much as Napoleon once said, in fighting partisans anywhere, one must fight like a partisan. So our new hybrid techniques are in part adopted to both, at least you've seen this in the Russian invasion of Crimea. New techniques are being adopted from terrorist techniques, but of course, and put into more advanced capabilities. Now, after the September 11 attacks on the World Trade Center and Pentagon, the Bush administration implemented an essentially America First approach to GWAT that largely sidelined the Europeans. Now, in previous conflicts before September 11th, the Europeans were part of the mission. Colin Powell said in reference to the Iraq War in 1990, building the coalition was most important. And that was generally true for the 1990-1995 Bosnian War, and to a certain extent true for the NATO-led air war over Kosovo in 1999, even though that was not fought with a UN mandate. And it also alienated Moscow and Beijing. But since 2001, the Europeans were really put on the sidelines until the intervention in Libya. Let me just go through that and just get a sort of background before I get to the present situation. So Rumsfeld, however, with Donald Rumsfeld, the defense secretary, said that the mission determines the coalition, and the coalition must not be permitted to determine the mission. So this opened the door for an American-led intervention in Afghanistan and in Iraq, in which the Europeans took second fiddle. NATO was not even included as an organization in the intervention in Afghanistan. And NATO itself, that is the French and Germans, refused to participate in the Iraq War. So we began to alienate the Allies, starting with, to a certain extent, with the war in Afghanistan, even though they all signed up, and it was a UN-sponsored mission, unlike the war in Iraq, which was not backed by the UN. So the Europeans, from the very beginning, began to critique what they saw as a blank check for a forever war, which has involved as many as 85 different countries now in counterterrorism operations. And the formulation at the beginning, and the Bush administration basically said it, was open-ended. It was a war aimed at every terrorist group of global reach, a war aimed at nations that provide aid or safe haven to terrorism. Oh, and it's a war that would polarize the state system into rival states that were either with us or with the terrorists. So this very formula opened up what this forever war really in Afghanistan and elsewhere, while previous wars, as Colin Powell had said, we must keep them limited with precise goals. Now, the Europeans thought that just the term war was being used to pursue goals that were not related to terrorism, and I think that became true with the Iraq War. They preferred the term fight or struggle against terrorism, in that the attacker, Al-Qaeda, was not a traditional state. Al-Qaeda was not Imperial Japan, which was the case in the beginning of U.S. entry into World War II. Furthermore, the concept of terrorism could be misleading as well, that though there's 100 different definitions, in my view, terrorism is a political, psychological term, and that the use of extreme violence, whether discriminate by states and anti-state actors against specific military or political targets, or it can be indiscriminate against non-combatants or civilians. But in both cases, and this is where I differ from some people, it's used to send a social and political message, whether the target is a specific military and political target, or whether the target is non-combatants or civilians. We're seeing state terrorism in the case of Russia and in attacks on Ukraine, civilian targets. That's still a message. Anyway, so the major difference between the Cold War guerrillas, we're going to start specifically about anti-state terrorism here more than state terrorism, but my basic point is they're interrelated. There's a dialectic between the two. State terrorists are always accusing anti-state terrorism, terrorists, and anti-state terrorism are always accusing the state of terrorism. So this interaction creates a dynamic that tends to widen and lengthen these conflicts. Anyway, what's the real difference between the guerrillas of the Cold War and Al-Qaeda and other anti-state terrorism today? And this is how it's the tactics they use. Cold War guerrillas used hit and run. They were irregular forces. They would hit regular forces and run. Al-Qaeda is hit and not run. It uses suicide missions. It uses other techniques in order to do so. To me, the tactics are really the issue here, not so much the ideology or where these attacks are taking place. Now, furthermore, Europeans were concerned that the legal ramification of the term war would erode civil liberties. As I said, they were concerned that the term terrorism was not linked to specific object or political groups, was not linked specifically to Al-Qaeda. You know, Al-Qaeda was the implied focus. The wording opened the door to other operations. The key problem here, though, is that one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter. So it's not sure how everybody can agree on who's the terrorist. This dialectic, as I mentioned before, creates an interaction between state-supported terrorism and anti-state terrorism that can end in this endless, can continue in an endless conflict. Nelson Mandela, Yasser Arafat, and Mahatma Begin were all considered terrorists by one side and freedom fighters by the other. Most recent, a more clear example just today is the Syrian Democratic Forces, who were seen as freedom fighters fighting by the US and Europeans as they fought against the Islamic State, are considered terrorists aligned with the PKK by Turkey. This has become an issue that which Turkey is using to block the NATO members of the new NATO membership of Finland and Sweden, for example. At least they started, they're still bringing it up. I don't know which way that's going to go. All right, most Europeans supported the US-backed war in Afghanistan, but they, as I said, they weren't entirely clear or agreement in the tactics. Was it military means primarily, special force operations, police and intelligence work, diplomacy and engagement, socioeconomic development? Which of these tools would be the best to fight terrorism? This issue has been going on in the background ever since the Afghan war. There are furthermore profound disagreements in legal terms as to whether ununiformed terrorists should be considered as soldiers and granted the same rights of the Geneva Convention. The whole complaint the Europeans had about Guantanamo Bay and other secret torture sites, enhanced interrogation techniques was opposed by Europe. Okay, so there were disputes, but in general, the Europeans went along with the war on terrorism. France was one of the first countries to leave before in 2012, I believe, 8 years before the US did. So the disputes were already mounting inside the alliance. Of course, Biden himself wanted to leave early or pull out earlier under Obama, but that when he was vice president. Now, the war in Iraq, though, divided the Europeans as the French and Germans opposed the war and the UK and Poland supported it. The French and Germans did not see this as part of the war on terrorism. They saw it as confounding Al-Qaeda with rogue states. They did not see that this intervention would be helpful. They argued instead for multilateral and enforced international inspections of Iraq's presumed nuclear weapons program. Now, Iraq was supporting different terrorist groups within the region against Israel and other states, by the way, but the whole point, main focus was on the nuclear issue, and the Europeans, at least the French and Germans, felt that this should have been handled through multilateral means, through the UN, and through pressures of international inspections. That failed as that approach failed as the United States intervened without regard for the UN, without regard for the French or German opinion. The invasion itself, though, gets back to my point that it opened the door for increased Iranian influence in Iraq. It's the first thing that the Iranians did was send in spies and agents with the refugees that were returning from Iran to Iraq, and opened the door for greater axis of resistance, what's later called an axis of resistance, in which Iran has infiltrated Lebanon, Syria, Yemen. And Iran has become more strongly backed by China and Russia. So while the EU had hoped to use diplomacy to put an end to the Iranian nuclear program, we are seeing China and Russia increasingly moving back, while Iran at the same time is threatening to develop a nuclear weapons capability. All right, so let me speed up because I realize I'm So the failed efforts, then the next phase of this was the failed effort of the Obama administration to alter the relationship between the US and Europeans under the Libyan intervention. Here, Libya was going to be seen as an all-European operation. This is what France, President Sarkozy and David Cameron, the UK Prime Minister, wanted. They wanted the operation to be all-European. But to do that, they needed American military support to wipe out Libyan air defense systems and provide air cover. US Congress said, no way, this is going to be an all-European thing. NATO must be involved. The US and NATO, US and Europeans compromised and got a Canadian commander to head the NATO-led mission in Libya. Here, the Europeans saw themselves again dependent on the US and NATO. Now, furthermore, initially the war was not aimed at regime change, but it still led to Gaddafi's assassination. And here the problem is that the collapse of the Libyan state, like the collapse of the Afghan and Iraqi states, has opened up the scope of terrorist actions in the region. There are two governments, war with each other, and Libya is now considered by government, American government, a virtual incubator of terrorist groups hosting all stripes of jihadi organizations, including ISIS and Al-Qaeda. And furthermore, there's major and regional power rivalry with Qatar, Turkey, as well as Italy, supporting the UN-recognized government of national accord, and the Libyan House of Representatives. The Libyan House of Representatives is the counter, backed by the Libyan Haftar, General Haftar, and he's backed by Egypt, Israel, the United Arab Emirates, France, and as well as Russia. And Russia has deployed its Wagner group there. So suddenly this war on terrorism becomes a region of major power rivalry. The US had no plan or what to do with Libya after its regime change, which really wasn't planned in many ways, and neither did the UN or the EU. Now, I'll conclude with Mali here. The French initially claimed to be triumphant in the war on terrorism in Mali after President Hollande in September 2013 had intervened to push back the radical Islamic State groups that seized control of northern Mali after a March 2012 coup. Now, this followed the collapse of Libya in 2011, much as Gaddafi warned. The collapse that meant in the Sahel region, it meant the end of Gaddafi's aid for the region, and it meant a tremendous flow of arms that went from Libya to Mali and other areas. So France tried Operation Serval, that failed, and it followed with Operation Barkhane, involving all the G5, the former French colonies, Burkina Faso, Chad, Mali, Mauritania, Niger. That has failed. Now Mali has staged a coup back in May 2021, and the Russians have made close ties with the new government, and the Wagner group of mercenaries is being deployed there. So, and furthermore, arms and other military instructors are being sent to Mali. So this is leading us, what I'm saying is we've engaged in what I call a whack-a-mole doctrine of striking both terrorist organizations and rogue states. Even the wars did not necessarily have anything to do with Al-Qaeda, which should have been the major focus throughout the whole time. And instead of quelling terrorism, these military interventions have directly or indirectly helped spread GWAT from Afghanistan and northern Pakistan to Iraq, Syria, Libya, Philippines, increasingly in the US-backed Saudi war in Yemen, Kenya and Somalia, and the French Sahel region, from former French colonial region. So the danger is that we are now merging this GWAT with major power rivalry, NATO enlargement, GWAT, US pivot to Asia, Abraham Accords, are all creating a new formation of alliances. And one, I think it's going to lead us to a road that's very dangerous. I will conclude there. I think I basically got 20
Thanks so much, Dr. Gardner. If you have any questions, you can put your questions in the Q&A function. In the meantime, I have some questions
Sure.
The first one would be my question. I want to first ask a question on global terrorism and which one is a big threat for you. Because we know that according to Rappaport, one eminent terrorism scholar, there are 4 waves of terrorism, and we are still in the 4th wave. And that started in 1980 and is still continuing, which is religious terrorism. And in today's world, jihadist groups have been big threat in many regions of the world. And the number of ISIS and Al-Qaeda branches that operate in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East is more than 30. Moreover, there's a growing concern on right-wing extremist groups also in the world. The world had a chance to see their capacity in the attacks that happened in the US last year. Additionally, there are still active left-wing and revolutionary groups in India, the Philippines, and Latin America. What types of terrorism and what groups would you consider a big threat in the near future for the world?
I only missed your first point. Could you repeat what you said? The first something about 2008.
According to Rappaport, one terrorism eminent scholar, there are 4 waves of terrorism. And the 4th wave started in 1980s, which is the current one, which is religious terrorism, which is jihadist terrorist organization.
Oh, okay, I got it. Yeah, well, you know, as I've tried to argue, our interventions have, in my view, have spread these and made them more militant, and now they're being backed by foreign powers. And I agree that we have both Islamic religious terrorism and secular. And I actually don't think there's a difference. I think even the secular ones have an aura of religion in that they have this vision of some sort of the utopia that they're fighting for. And religious terrorists have a different vision of utopia. Anyway, the point is that the reality is we've been using certain terrorist groups on our side and fighting others, and sometimes those terrorist groups shift to our side and sometimes they shift together. I mean, in the war in Afghanistan, Al-Qaeda was aligned with us as long as Americans, as long as we were fighting the Soviet Union. But as soon as that war was over for them, Afghanistan became theirs, then they could shift their attention on the Americans. So these groups, and then the problem is you don't know how many of these groups are actually operating on their own and how much are actually operating with the financing and the directions of states. And that's why I want to say this. Please, with me, never use the term non-governmental actor for a terrorist organization. Al-Qaeda is not Amnesty International. And I hear that, I know you didn't say this, but a lot of people say this, and I read it all the time. A terrorist organization is an anti-state organization that wants to change the government by violence. So that's why it's an anti-state organization, not a non-government. Anyway, my point is, it depends on the strategic situation in each area as to whether one group might be more dangerous than another. But I would say the right-wing movements in the United States do propose a threat to our democracy. And I am very worried about them. And I am very worried about the possibility that Trump can give them more say if he becomes elected next year. And I said this in my book, World War Trump. So my point is, I honestly can't give you a relative which region or which concern is better, because we're entering into a new global conflict, major power rivalry, in which geopolitics will be determining the game, not some moral decision as to whether this organization has committed so many terrorist acts versus this one. I'm afraid we're going to have to decide, Americans and Europeans together will have to decide in accord with their own interests which groups best serve their interests. But even that's problematic. We've made mistakes. We see the issue with the Syrian Democratic Front, the French-backed groups in Mali that the Malian government saw as terrorist interests. You create a counter-reaction among either a state or another anti-state act. But that's the best I can do, I think, answering your question.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Dr. Gardner. And another question, what types of terrorism is more threatening for Europe and US? So are they homegrown extremists, lone actors with right-wing ideology, or some ethno-nationalist groups in US or Europe? So which ones would you think more threatening?
Well, I have to say again, I am very concerned about the white ring extremists in the United States. They've been on the list for quite a while, and they've been being watched, and they're armed. And you hate to think that's happening in America. In Europe, I'm more concerned about some of the Islamist groups that have attacked. I've had, I know students who were killed in the Bataclan. I know students and new students that were killed in the Bataclan attacks, and there's still that threat is still there. And the people, and I went up to Brussels where those attacks originated from in the neighborhood where those attacks, and these were middle class, for Belgium, middle class kids who grew up from Moroccan or North African background, who felt totally alienated from European Brussels and Belgium and European society, and they formed their own cliques, secret organizations. So the main problem is alienation. If a group, for whatever reason, feels that it's alienated and not part of the democratic process, don't participate in local governance in any way or national governance, those groups can become alienated and turn to violence. And it can be lone wolves too. But the white supremacists, the other problem here is the information is allowing lone wolves to interconnect, and so they're not really lone wolves. So that's another factor. Which is the worst? That's the problem for the FBI and agencies to observe, because you don't know which group is going to act. Look, no one suspected the September 11th attacks. We had information. If we had put the pieces together, maybe we would have known it was going to happen. But no one saw that at the time. So my answer to the last question, you really don't know who's going to do what until the time comes, and you've got to get the information, which creates the problem of surveillance and civil liberties issues. So we have a whole range of issues that are very difficult to deal with, and trying to stop this. But I think the main thing is to allow people, even if they're highly critical, to let them talk, to let them express themselves and get a dialogue. But if you don't get a dialogue going and they just stay in their own groups, you won't move away. They'll just remain committed to their cause. And I can see a number of causes coming that will create more acts of terrorism, I'm afraid.
Yeah. Thank you. And another question: why have states failed to fight effectively against global terrorist groups?
Yeah.
What are some issues on the table? Is it because of states' capacity, lack of resources, states, also you mentioned about state terrorism, states sponsoring terrorism, endemic corruption, porous borders, or ongoing political and economic grievances, or spread of twisted and violent versions of jihadism?
Yeah, I put the burden, or put the weight on corruption. I feel that the government, regardless democratic or not, if it's not perceived as corrupt, and can talk with all the different communities within its society and adjust and talk about their political and social issues and can address those issues, you're not going to get terrorism. And regardless of how diverse the society is, if you can reach out to those groups. But if you can't reach out to those groups and you locked into your own self-profitable industries and corruption, you're going to create alienation. And that's what the French found in Mali. I mean, their operation, the first operation in 2013, looked successful. The Malian people supported them. Then suddenly, the Malian people turned against the French because they were supporting the corrupt government. So then that corrupt government gets overthrown, and now that government is turned to Russia. And Russia is suddenly seen as a good guy as opposed to the French. So, a history of colonialism is certainly a problem. That hasn't gone away in most of these countries where terrorism is very rampant. But my main point is corruption and the ability to talk to the different factions and ethnic groups in a society and address their concerns. If you can get the average local population on your side, the really radicals will be marginalized. If you don't get the average population on your side in the various regions, those guys will begin to manipulate the movement, the social grievances, and oppose the government. But we did a lousy job in Afghanistan. Libya had no plan for whatsoever. Mali's a disaster. Russians are taking, maybe they'll do a better job. I don't think. You know, I just see the whole thing. By wiping out state power in Iraq too, we opened the door to ISIS ultimately. I forgot to mention that one. So the point is that by wiping out the state power structures and not creating a dialogue with a really equitable dialogue with the different groups in that society, you're bound to get terror.
And another question from Ernesto Savana on US and European approach to terrorism. Mm-hmm. Could you please shortly summarize as bullet points similarities and differences between US and European approach to terrorism in the world?
Okay. Well, I think the first issue on the Europeans, they prefer to emphasize socioeconomic development. They believe that they're giving money and resources to states to help prevent the rise, prevent the alienation of the different groups by providing social and economic assistance. And at least in ideal, I think they're correct. It just hasn't, as I said, it didn't work in the case of Mali that way. But the French are going to reassess their approach to Mali and hopefully come up with a more. They'll stay in the background and let the Africans handle both the negotiations with the terrorist groups and the military interventions, with the French providing background assistance. That's what they're thinking about now. Maybe that will help change the Sahel region. So I think socioeconomic assistance and dialogue is at least what some of the Europeans were saying from the beginning, but those voices were not heard.
And another interesting question from Katrina Klein-Schultz. You alluded to the fact of state sponsorship of terrorist groups and European states and US using some of these groups when it suits their interest. In the face of the superpower rivalry and the West competing against each other, what do you see is the fate of state in Africa, Middle East, and Asia that has become the center of actions, considering that some of these states are fragile?
Yeah, I've mentioned Mali and the Sahel. Certainly, the destabilization in Iraq, wiping out the whole state apparatus, the Ba'ath party, that literally almost every elite was a member of the Ba'ath Socialist Party, wiping that out altogether, destabilized the entire society and made it very difficult to form a kind of federation of Kurds and Shiite and Sunni. The Shiite Sunni felt alienated. They started forming Arab awakening movements, and that ultimately morphed into ISIS. So that's just, that then was fought by major power intervention in which Russia and France and the US and other states intervened. So that's just the first illustration of this major power rivalry already there. I didn't mention that in my talk. Iran is still backing different groups in Syria as well as Lebanon. And the problem is Russia and China are moving back behind Iran and key actors that are going to make it very difficult to forge compromises with these powers. And that's why I'm saying we're moving into this Eurasian alliance, Russia, China, Iran. Turkey could go either way. Turkey's what I call a swing state. It can move either towards Russia and China or towards the US, but it has conflicts with Greece. and it doesn't like the fact the Western powers, Europeans, have supported the Kurds. Those factors are pushing Erdogan closer to Russia and China. On the other hand, he's got problems of Russia and China too. He sends sending drone weapons to Ukraine against Russia. So it's all full of contradictions there. But the point is that it's a pivot state. India is a pivot state. It's caught in the middle. It's in conflict with China. It's arms from India, but it doesn't want to turn to the United States entirely. So we have what I call pivot states. Other groups like Al-Qaeda and Islamic State are wild cards. They can side with one side or the other. We don't know, depending on the situation and other movements, of course. So again, it really depends on immediate assessment of the actions of Russia, China, Iran to determine where they're going to move next, and then try to counterbalance those actions or find some way to compromise with Beijing or Moscow, which is not in the cards at the moment because of the war in Ukraine. But my point is that this situation will get intensifying in conflict the more the Ukraine-Russia war continues, because the Russians will play with Mali. They'll play in the Balkans. They'll play in other areas to create little fuses. Fitna, it's called in Arabic, I believe.
Thank you, Dr. Gardner. Also, one question from our audience on Ukraine and Russia war. Will we have to deal with a resurgent Russia even beyond Putin?
Good question. I have an article on that coming. It's out on the MERR, M-E-R-R website, in which I'm arguing Dmitry Trenin, who used to be a moderate, very pro-West. I've lectured with him at different NATO conferences in the past. He just came out saying that the U.S., because the U.S. has defined the war against Russia as to bleed Russia, this will turn moderates against the West and for Putin. So even though there's dissent and Putin is trying to repress that dissent quite violently, moderates are beginning to think, oh, the West is against us. And so therefore, even if Putin falls, in my view, it ain't going to be Gorbachev a Gorbachev type that will take his place. And we've seen this in different revolutionary wars where we have one hardliner being taken, another hardliner takes their place. On the other hand, when the Korean War ended, when Stalin died, so almost immediately. So, but as long as the Russians are perceiving the West as trying to undermine their power and destabilize them in any way, a harder line leadership come to power. That's why I'm arguing for diplomacy now. I think the U.S. and Europeans have to work with Ukraine and Russia and put an end to this war as soon as possible.
And how about recently published European Union Terrorism Situation Trend Report? And last week, according to this report, 15 terrorist attacks happened in Europe in 2021, which it was 55 in 2020. So there was a very big drop between 2 years. Mm-hmm. And how do you explain this drop? Any specific policies or strategies in Europe? Well,
I don't. For years they were saying there were less wars and less conflicts, and yet suddenly there's conflicts. These statistical issues to me don't say much, because it all depends on the situation. Whether something goes wrong somewhere, suddenly you're going to have more terrorist action. So just the reduction at this time, to me, that doesn't mean anything. Unfortunately, I wish it would, but. As I said, you see all the analysis that say that interstate conflict has receded, but domestic conflicts have risen. That was what they were saying a few years ago. Now the interstate conflicts have come back. So, I mean, I've been predicting this Russia alienation for years. Nobody would believe me that the Russians were going to backlash. That backlash took place in 2014. It was coming, and to me, it was obvious from 1991 on. But you know, nobody wanted to believe it was going to. So, and the same thing for terrorism. I'm not convinced just because it's gone down in numbers a little bit that it won't come back.
And the last question, Dr. Gardner. US and EU have conflicting views on Hezbollah.
Right.
It is officially designated a terrorist organization in the US, but some EU countries do not see Hezbollah as a terrorist organization.
Or they see part of it.
Yeah. Do you think these conflicting views create vacuums and impact global counterterrorism strategies against Hezbollah and other Iranian-backed groups?
Yeah, no, that's a really important question. You know, the Europeans wanted to keep a door open to Hezbollah, regardless of its military actions. They wanted to keep the door open to Iran, and so they saw the social programs as beneficial in Lebanon and elsewhere that Hezbollah engages in. So this issue was to try to keep a door open. And I always think it's important to keep a door open to everybody, whether it's Putin or Xi Jinping in China or the Ayatollahs in Iran. That's diplomacy. And I really think the Europeans are wiser in trying to at least keep a door open. Now, the United States shut that door by ending the JCPOA, the nuclear accords. So it doesn't impact, because the U.S. shut the door, it doesn't impact anything like this. And so the Europeans cut out of recognizing Hezbollah. It wouldn't change that much the situation, but it still leaves a lever there in case negotiations come back. You see what I'm saying? So I'm more in favor of keeping the door open. Talks, even if the talks are secret. You know, Maggie Thatcher was calling Nelson Mandela a terrorist and horrible, and yet they were talking to the African National Congress the whole time. The same thing for the IRA. The Brits kept communications with the IRA, even if they were blowing up hotels to kill Thatcher. So my point is that you have to keep a double game there. You can act tough vocally, but keep a voice behind the scene, keep a dialogue.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gardner, for very insightful and informative talk.
Hope you enjoyed it, and you can contact me on my website, www.hallgardner.com, and different articles on it. Got to buy my books too.
Okay, thank you. And also, if you want to join us, in one of GTTAC events, please let us know. And thank you all for joining today's event.
Thank you again.